Hello everybody, I am Jurt Ross, the Genie Vlogger, and welcome back to another Professional Genealogist Reacts. On today's video, I will be reacting to the Ancestor Paradox by Minute Earth. Now, this is a channel that I am familiar with. I don't think this is going to have anything to do with DNA, except maybe discussing the fact that we don't inherit DNA from all of our ancestors, but I'm not really going to say much else because it's a short video, so let's just jump into it.
Because you have two parents, and each of those parents has two parents, and so on, your ancestors, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and on, should add up pretty fast. In fact, by the time you get just 37 generations back, you would have 137 billion ancestors just in that 37th generation alone. That's more than the 117 billion or so people that have ever lived on Earth, which is impossible. So you must have a lot fewer ancestors than you might think.
So one of the things that this kind of reminds me of is one of my favorite articles of all time that related to genealogy, which was from a blog called Wait But Why. And it was really interesting because they not only talked about this in terms of ancestry, but they also talked about this in descendancy, of the fact that in 1,000 years, you're going to have all of these descendants, as long as you do have descendants still living then, but as long as you have a certain amount of descendants that last on, eventually it'll become so exponentially huge that on top of that, a lot of the people that you may know may also be ancestors to your descendants as well.
Hi, I'm Cameron, and this is Minute Earth. To make sense of this, let's say, for example, that I don't know, your parents are first cousins. I know, bear with me for a second. That would mean that two of your grandparents are siblings. And since siblings have the same parents, and therefore the same ancestry, a bunch of these ancestors are duplicates. We can really just count them once. Going back to our 37 generations thing, that's more than 34 billion ancestors we would no longer be counting.
So this is what we refer to as pedigree collapse. Pedigree meaning your ancestry, and when there's a collapse, basically less ancestors than what you would expect. So like he's showing here, if you have your parents as first cousins, then that's 34 billion ancestors tracing 37 generations back that are duplicates, and thus they're counted once. And in genetic genealogy, we'll often discuss pedigree collapse just in the sense of, is there pedigree collapse in a family tree? AKA, are there known ancestors who were cousins marrying each other? Which was very, very common.
That might sound like an extreme example, but more distant relationships, like fourth cousins, which we don't even consider to be that closely related.
I consider fourth cousins somewhat closely related, and I've actually thought about making charts of my definition of closeness in cousins, because to me, I always find like first to second cousins I would call immediate cousins, I guess you could say, or maybe close cousins, and then third and fourth, and then maybe even fifth cousins I'd call like a medium distance, and then it's sixth cousins and further that I would then call distant relatives. But then again, I'm also a genealogist who has spent years upon years tracking down thousands of my third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth cousins and further for years and years and years, and I've connected with so many. And for anyone who watches my main channel and you saw my trip from last year going over to Europe, I ended up meeting a bunch of fourth and fifth and sixth cousins. So I'm definitely a little biased in that point.
And our family histories are full of lots and lots of inbreeding. That might sound pretty gross to you and me, but mating with relatives hasn't always been frowned upon.
Now, this is also an important concept to understand if you're doing genetic genealogy, because it plays into the idea of endogamy. Endogamy is just the practice of a certain population group where only people within that population group are having children with other people in that population group. This can be due to religious reasons, geographic reasons, cultural reasons. So Jews are an example as a population, because for many generations, only Jews have married other Jews and had children with those Jews. And this endogamy causes the descendants of these population groups to share much more DNA in common with each other than other populations typically do. So examples of other population groups that are known to be endogamous: Pacific Islanders have some of the highest endogamy because they're geographically isolated. So they don't have as much of exogamy, what's known as when population groups are having children with other population groups. So basically people are going in and out of the population, and so that kind of controls the shared amount of DNA between all of the people in that population. And just one last example of an endogamous population are the population groups in the southern part of the United States that are the Cajun and Creole populations. But endogamy does not involve only pedigree collapse, the inbreeding cousins marrying cousins. It also involves what's known as double cousins, which basically just means that you have someone where you're related to them in multiple ways. So the purest form of this is what's known as double cousins. So think of it that there's a pair of brothers, they go to college and they meet these sisters. Well, one brother marries one of the sisters, the other brother marries the other sister. They both have children, and those children are first cousins to each other in two ways. They're first cousins because their mothers are sisters, and they're first cousins because their fathers are brothers. So they're first cousins in two ways. They share more DNA than a first cousin typically would, and so that affects the DNA. But when you're dealing with endogamy, it's generations upon generations of lots of pedigree collapse and lots of double relations. But there are a lot of families that aren't endogamous that have more recent pedigree collapse or double relations, and that will change how you're matching with certain matches. So if you've ever done a DNA test and you come from one of these endogamous populations, you may have noticed that you have a lot of matches that seem like they should be close enough to figure out how they're related, but you just aren't able to, and that's likely because they aren't as closely related as they may seem.
Heck, Albert Einstein married his first cousin, and certain royal families actively encouraged inbreeding.
So here he even shows double cousins, and we can see first cousins on mom's side and second cousins on dad's side. They did have kids, and so those kids would be related to each other in a few ways because their parents are cousins. But on top of that, that means that when they look at their DNA matches, if they were to do a DNA test, they would probably have a lot of cousins where they're going to share much more DNA with them than they typically would, just because they're coming from this double cousin relationship, as well as coming from a couple who are from the Jewish population, which is an endogamous population. So they're dealing both with endogamy, pedigree collapse, and double cousinship. As for the Habsburgs, that's obviously a whole different story, but he shows a marriage that honestly was not too uncommon, which is known as an avunculate marriage, the marriage between an uncle and niece.
But the biggest reason for all of this inbreeding is that throughout most of human history, we lived in small groups with limited baby-making options, which led to a lot of trees that just don't fork very much. But wait, so far we've been defining your ancestors as everyone you're descended from. If instead we think about an ancestor as someone that actually passed genes on to you, the number is much, much smaller. I know that sounds paradoxical. I mean, you had to get all of your genes from somewhere, so of course they came from your ancestors, but they didn't come from all of your ancestors. Imagine that instead of passing along their genes, people passed along different kinds of candy. To inherit your genome, you close your eyes and you draw an equal number of candies from your mom's bowl and your dad's bowl, each of which contain a mix of everything they got from their ancestors. There are going to be a lot of candies that you don't get. These represent genes that you don't inherit. This is obviously an oversimplification, but I hope you get the idea.
This is actually one of the best oversimplifications I've ever seen for understanding recombination. Now, it should be noted what he's discussing here is only part of your entire genome, part of your DNA, because he's only discussing your autosomal DNA, the 22 pairs of chromosomes. For the 23rd pair of chromosomes, those are your sex chromosomes. So XX, XY, and that is inherited a little bit differently. So if you're a male, your X chromosome is coming from your mother, and she has two X chromosomes, one from her father and one from her mother, so they recombine for you, but you don't get any X chromosome from your father, you get a Y chromosome from your father. And he got that Y chromosome from his father pretty much unchanged, and from his father and so on, and that allows the Y chromosome to be traced in a different way. So that is inherited very differently. And then the X chromosome for females, well, females have an X chromosome from their mother, an X chromosome from their father, but the X chromosome they get from their mother recombines because the mother has two X chromosomes to recombine, whereas the father, he has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. So the female will inherit an X chromosome from her father unchanged. So if we look at a pair of half-sisters, we'll be able to tell if they share a father or a mother, because if half-sisters share a father, they're going to have an entire X chromosome match, because across one of their entire X chromosomes, they're going to match because they would have inherited the X chromosome exactly the same from their father. But if a pair of half-sisters only share a mother, then they're only going to share part of their X chromosome because the DNA that they inherited from their mother for their X chromosome was recombined, just like it's showing here on screen, so they might not have picked all of the same candies. So hopefully adding in that extra part didn't make it too confusing, because this stuff is really confusing to deal with sometimes. But just something I wanted to mention, that this is just the autosomal DNA he's discussing in this image. And one other thing I want to mention is that you notice that all of the DNA that you don't inherit from your parents, well, there is a tool on GEDmatch called the Evil Twin tool. And what that is if you've had a DNA test done and you've had both of your parents do a DNA test, you can create a profile of all of the DNA that you did not inherit from your parents, aka your evil twin. It's not very useful genealogically, most especially in the fact that if you've already had your parents' test, you're going to get more information from your parents' test than your own test or your evil twin's test. But it is just kind of a fun thing to do if you are a genetic genealogy nerd like I am. But this is definitely one of the best oversimplifications of recombination I've seen, because it's exactly like it shows, where for what's coming from what seems to be mom, I guess, on the left side, we're getting an even amount, 2 yellows, 2 reds. But then on the dad's side, we're getting 3 blues and 1 purple. And this happens with true DNA. So when you look at the DNA you inherited from your grandparents, it's not going to be 25% perfectly across the board. Sometimes it might be, but more often than not, it's probably going to be 22% and 28%. And then if you look at your great-grandparents, it could get even crazier. So we have a generalized idea of recombination, which helps us understand if we're getting certain types of DNA matching, where we might expect that. So especially like if you get a percentage in your admixture that says you're 9% Jewish, but you didn't know you had any Jewish ancestry. Well, if you understand recombination rates, 50% from your parents, 25% about from your grandparents, about 12.5% from your great-grandparents, and then 6.25 from your second greats, etc., etc., etc. So if we're getting a 9% reading, we're going to expect that to be somewhere between a great-grandparent and a second great-grandparent, because a great-grandparent shares on average 12.5, second great 6.25. So knowing recombination, it's going to probably be somewhere in there.
You can see how very quickly you might by chance receive fewer or no genes from some ancestors because you received extra from another. Over time, this process means that most of your distant ancestors didn't pass on any DNA to you. If you do the math, which is complicated, you only have a 50% chance of having inherited any DNA at all from a randomly selected ancestor 10 generations back, and a 3% chance of inheriting anything from an ancestor 15 generations back. The majority of your ancestors farther back than that almost certainly didn't pass along any DNA to you. The DNA you did inherit came from only a very small slice of the pyramid of all of your supposed ancestors. So your family tree might be smaller than you think, and your gene pool is even smaller.
All right, that was a quick, easy video, really well done. There's a reason why Minute Earth is one of those channels I feel like so many people have seen. I do have to give props just one more time again for the visualization in terms of candy for recombination. I don't know why I've never seen such a good example for recombination. Maybe other people have done something similar with that, but I don't know. This one I just felt did a really good job. In my recent reaction to another video discussing this similar stuff, I got a comment from Rock in Woodworks, who is a YouTube creator who I actually did a reaction to years ago. Very active on my channel, commenting and stuff, and he had a comment kind of discussing the idea that even though we have ancestors that we're not inheriting any DNA from them, there are certain ancestors where, because of the fact that we do descend from them more than others, we likely have higher amounts of DNA from them. So we were talking about pedigree collapse before, but when we look at that pedigree collapse, if we have, let's say, an ancestor that we end up happening to be, descended from them in 10 different ways, well, there's 10 times as many chances that we're going to inherit some small part of their DNA. So if we're looking back at that generation where we only have that 50% chance, well, if we change that statistic for a specific ancestor because they show up 10 times in that generation, then that's going to change how we're going to expect it. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting discussion about how with inheritance, there's so much complexity to it. And it was kind of one of those things where it's getting a little too difficult to just even conceptualize. But shout out Rockin' Woodworks. But I would have loved to see this video also talk about the concept that I was mentioning before from that Wait But Why blog, talking about not just the ancestry, but thinking about it in terms of descendancy. If you have children and your children have children and so on, within a certain amount of generations, you may have so many descendants, and within just a couple hundred years, you might have thousands upon thousands of descendants. But then even more, when you look at those thousands upon thousands of descendants, well, there are going to be so many generations in front of you, meaning if they looked at the amount of ancestors they had in your generation, you'd be one of thousands. And you likely know a lot of the thousands of people that are the other ancestors of your descendants. I don't know if other genealogists have found this, but I always love when I find things in my ancestry where one line of ancestors was interacting with a different line of ancestors that didn't meet up until generations upon generations later, where they both had descendants who married, and that marriage is my ancestry. Something that I think is much more common if you're descending from a community that lived in a certain area for many generations upon generations, such as my Dutch Jewish ancestry. If you enjoyed this reaction and you'd like to see more reactions just like this, be sure to check out this video of mine right here. Thank you to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members.